Live. All right. Hey, everybody. Having some technical difficulties. I don't understand why my live feed isn't coming up. But I have it on my phone now, so we'll get started. I gave a little introduction as to when my feed isn't coming up. Oh, no, my phone. So, basically, I started off by saying tonight's episode is the theory of evolution. We'll give a background on the life on Earth, animals, and the evolution of us, humans. And we're going to start off basically by telling or defining what a theory is in terms of the common misconception between layman and science. You know, scientists have a theory that's been proven time and time again, and that's cold hard fact. It's not necessarily, oh, you know, I think that, you know, John is running late because I theorize he took too long in the shower. You know, that's a hypothesis. That's something that you need to actually prove and look for evidence. A theory is more along the lines of what is concrete and given based upon the facts at hand, what it truly means, what it truly is. So it's like having, well, we'll get into that in the next slide, but welcome to episode 12, the theory of evolution. I'll be solo tonight on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And basically, you know, we're going to go through, you know, what a theory is. We're going to go through where life came from, the domains of life. Then we'll go into a little bit of, like, you know, genetic evidence towards the evolution theory of evolution in terms of Hox genes, Homebox genes, which are the set of genes that actually give you your segmentation. You know, I don't think everyone knows this, but, you know, when you look at a lobster or basically a bug, you know, it's got a head, it's got those little segments and everything like that. You're very similar to a lobster. You know, you have your head, you have your vertebra, your somites basically when they're in development, and then you have your long bone in your arm, two long bones here, your humerus and your ulna, and then you have your phalanges? Your radius and, radius and ulna, sorry. You know, I haven't taken anatomy in quite some time. But if you think about it, your arm is very similarly developed as your leg. You have one long bone at the top, and then two long bones further down, more distal, and then you have your tarsals, metatarsals, and all that fun stuff in your feet. And then after we do a little bit of that, I'll show you an example of evolution of a particular protein family or a gene family, in particular Globin, which is a protein found in your blood or actually in your muscles, myoglobin, and it carries oxygen to where it needs to throughout the body, and how we have beta globin in amphibians all the way through mammals. And then in mammals, you actually have an expansion of those genes to have multiple different types of globin, gamma, delta, epsilon, and even alpha, you know. So let's get into the heart of the matter. So you're going to have to forgive me. So this is my first time doing this solo, so I'm talking at you guys directly. And if anybody out there wants to give me some updates about the Giants-Packers game, I'd be more than happy about that. So let's get started. Scientific theory versus layman's theory. A scientific theory or theorem is something that's considered proven. It's been time and time again through observation, through scientific evidence, through experimentation. You know, it's not just one little thing that says, oh, hey, you know, we did one experiment this one time that says evolution is true. No, it looks at a multifaceted, a multi-pronged approach to proving that evolution is like a dogma. It's law. And the thing about it I really hate is, thank you, Joe. So it looks at it like, I really wish they would call it the law of evolution, similarly to, you know, how you have your law of thermodynamics in physics. Your law 1, 2, and 3, I don't know exactly. I know that you can't make new energy, you can't, unless, you know, you smash atoms and you break it up, like the nuclear bomb. But, you know, it's a conservation of energy, different things like that. So what I would really appreciate is if that, you know, we could change the theory of evolution to the law of evolution, because it gives it more of a concrete, you know, phrasing that colloquial people, you know, normal layman's people will go, oh, wow, the law of evolution. Wow, that sounds like a lot harder than, oh, the theory. And I have a little meme up here. The colloquial used word theory refers to a scientific hypothesis. And what the difference between a hypothesis and a theory is that hypothesis is something where I'm in the lab and I want to prove, based upon small evidence or a small subset of evidence that, A equals B, and I use a couple experiments to prove that, or at least to elucidate that, or to show a correlation between A and B. It's a little finicky, but in a theory, you've done that hypothesis. So you start off with a little hypothesis and you build up with evidence, and it eventually becomes the theory of something. So yeah, it was a hypothesis by Charles Darwin that through natural selection, species change and become different forms to adapt to their environment. With evolution in particular, that started out as one hypothesis, and then DNA came up, and we started building more evidence and more evidence and more evidence, stacking the evidence, and we'll go through some of it, a good portion of it tonight. However, I really want to drive home the fact that a hypothesis is something that you start off with. A theory is something that you attain over time through constantly just delving deep into the topic, really, using experiment after experiment after experiment after experiment, that with reproducibility, and then when you come to a consensus, you can go, wow, this is how it worked. This is how it actually happens. And, I really hate the fact that certain people kind of manipulate the wordage rather than actually looking at the evidence. And I think that's why you get a lot of people that deny evolution or deny climate science or anything like that. And it's really kind of disheartening to scientists such as myself, especially in the field of biology, because there's been countless lives that have been devoted towards this topic, and this is what the consensus is. It really is that we came from a simpler form of life, simpler. That's kind of like our arrogance talking about how humans might be, we're more complex than, bacteria or yeast. But in all reality, they're very complex organisms themselves, and they have adapted to a niche, just like that we've adapted to a niche. And we'll get into that when we get into human evolution. But let's talk about, simple to, bigger, larger forms of life, more complex. I have a hierarchy here by Aristotle, where, he started with realm of being, realm of becoming, and realm of being. There's non-being at the bottom, minerals, plants, animals, man, and then he went into, what I would call bullshit, demons, angels, and God. Whether that you believe or whatever, bless your heart. There's a hierarchy. You can see that around you. You see that there's wolves, there's dogs. Clearly we bred wolves to become dogs. So there, in and of itself, is an example of really microevolution. Where we actually, by intelligent design, I don't know how intelligent it was because there's pugs and all these other little chihuahuas, dogs running around, but neither here nor it's not my place to tell you what kind of dog is cool or not. Huskies are the best. We've always tried to categorize, and it's called taxonomy basically, and we divide life into categories, and in particular there's 3 domains of life. Bacteria, which we all know, E. coli, God, I'm blanking on bacteria names. Salmonella, Listeria, all these different things. Ebola, that's a bacteria. No, that's a virus. Sorry. Goodness. Excuse me. Ebola is a virus. Whew. My PI would kill me if she heard that. But it's basically, let's go into it. Bacteria is a simple form of life where it has a plasma membrane, which is basically a phospholipid membrane where there's a hydrophobic group, 2 tails sticking off of it, another 2 tails, and a head. And basically that's what encapsulates all of the cells of your body and bacteria. And certain bacteria have cell walls, some don't. Basically they're considered the lowest form of life. But they've adapted, and they're inside of you. We've adapted with them. We've become a symbiotic relationship together. And, they're basically where we came from. Bacteria is the first thing that came out of the primordial goo. And there's a couple theories on to how the primordial goo actually became life and different things like that. So think of it like this. When Earth was first formed, there were no oceans, and it took a while for oceans to form and, build up enough water and so on and so forth through whatever processes that are beyond me in my preparation for this episode. And eventually, you get sulfur mixed in from, volcanic eruptions, you get comets hitting the Earth, you get icy blasts from asteroids. The Earth was actually 2 planets at one time that collided, became one, and actually spit off the moon. And, with the moon circling the Earth and churning the waters, you have ultraviolet radiation coming in from the sun. You basically make like a petri dish from the ocean. And it basically gave all the parts to mix around and mix it up. It's kind of like when you're making bread or you're baking a cake and you put all the parts in and you mash them up, you knead them up, and you start making a bread or breaking, by putting in energy. And that's basically your oven. Or, in the case of the Earth, it's the moon with gravitation going around and around with the tide in and out, volcanic eruptions, hydro vents at the bottom of the ocean. And, I kind of believe that it's more along the lines of more deep in hydro vents where you need pressure, and the pressure would bring all these things together and they start interacting with one another. And it's an extremely slow process. Life didn't appear until, 3 billion years ago, I think. Don't quote me on that. But there's conflicting theories about when first life actually popped up, because there's only so much in the fossil record, because you can't actually, preserve bacteria. You can preserve big cultures of bacteria, and that's where we see some mats of algae and different things along those lines. But it's really difficult to pinpoint when exactly life happened. But Earth is 4.6 billion years ago, and if it's 3 billion or 2 billion or how many billion after, think about it like this. You can deny the fact that maybe something came in and made life and boom, it's what it happened. But over time, these chemicals and things mix together and mash together and mix together and mix together, and over time and slowly came together to form the first cell, or a pocket. That what I was talking about with the plasma membrane that surrounds all cells in your body. It got all these things together in tight area, and it started working like a system. And a lot of people say, oh well, that's very impossible. It's so highly unlikely. Well, life, in my opinion, is the universe trying to ultimately understand itself. But it's kind of like a rash, or it's kind of like a disease where it just spreads throughout the universe. And ultimately, if it finds a nice warm bed, or a nice warm area like water, air, sunlight, all that fun stuff, in a perfect mix, you get life. It doesn't matter. Hopefully that we can prove that someday, that there's life on Mars and, different places. But it really comes together that once you get these things in a tight enough area, chemistry and the laws of physics dictate that it'll eventually build and build and build and build. And that's what we see, when we go from simple bacteria to Archaea, which is another domain of single-celled microorganisms. These microbes are prokaryotes, which means that they don't have a nucleus and they don't have membrane-bound organelles in the cell. So basically, in bacteria and Archaea, all their machinery is floating around. It's just mashing around, it's hitting each other, and there's order to it. However, it's not as structured as, say, you and I, or the amoebas that are floating around in the water, or dogs or cats, or even apes and monkeys. So what I mean by organelles are little organs. So your body has organs. It has a brain, it has liver, it has a stomach, different things like that. So in that regard, these little organelles are basically the cell's little organs. They do a particular function. The brain thinks, your liver detoxes, going back to our detox episode. And, it really comes down to the fact that life progressively gets more complex. It builds on each other. It builds on the simplest things. So when you're building a building, you put the foundation in. Say that's the first primordial goo life, and then you put another layer on. That's your bacteria. Then you put another layer on. That's your archaea. Then you put another layer on. That's your single-celled eukaryotes, your protists, your amoebas. Then you put another layer on, and then you start becoming multicellular, where you start functioning in colonies. And then at that point in time, you can start diversifying. So think about it like how, people's civilization popped up, where, you had one person that would go out and hunt and gather, you had one person that knitted stuff, and then eventually, cities arose. And at that point in time, you could specialize. There were carpenters, there were specific types of farmers, there were specific types of people that did building, there's, people that did accounting, there are people that did writing, scribes, and different things like that. And it just builds, and there's such a pattern to it that you really need to look at it like, wow, we're all interrelated. All these different forms of life here are really just, interrelated, and we're all one big family. And I really, I hate to say that, a lot of people like the new, I don't even know, people who believe that the world is only 10,000 years old. It's a crock of crap. There's sediment, there's rock evidence for that, and there's life evidence for it. There's DNA evidence against that. And it just shows that, everything's interconnected, and that it, like I said, it builds on one another. And one example of this is Hox genes. So we went from single-celled bacteria, single-celled Archaea, and eventually progressed to, closing up our DNA into a nucleus, structuring the cell of these eukaryotes. This part does this, this part does this, this part does this. And it all does this by gene manipulation and doubling of genes. And then when you double a gene, so you have two of the same gene, this one can go off and do different things. It can mutate and eventually become something different. So what I have behind me are Hox genes. And Hox genes are for multicellular organisms that came from the primordial goop, amoebas and protists and different things that started to diversify and branch off and use these mutations to kind of, build and become more specialized and have, one part of their organism do one job and then another part do another job. In particular, Hox genes or Homebox genes signal for, segmentation from top to bottom. And they're preserved from organisms all the way as simple as the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, to zebrafish, to regular fish, to humans, to dogs, to cats. And in a simpler organism like Drosophila, there's only one set of Hox genes. And then when you get to more complex organisms, say like mammals, there's 4 families, A, B, C, and D, that are all function to do, here's your head, here's your chest, here's your legs, here's this arm, the humerus is right here, one bone that progresses in, moves out. So it's a segmentation type pattern. It's a building plan to make a body. And you can take a human Hox gene from this group here and insert it into the Drosophila, and it works perfectly. It works exactly how it would. Can't really do the opposite because I don't really know if we're going to be manipulating humans anytime soon. But that's basically how it functions. These genes are built upon older versions of themselves to really, build a body plan based upon, what's already working. You don't really want to, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But if you can manipulate it to modify something to make it better, that's what these genes do. And, it comes by, you have one set, split off, make 2, and then that second one can, specialize itself, get mutations. So essentially, how is it all? Yes, so, and this is all predicated upon, adapting to a particular niche. So you have, fish that swim in the ocean, in particular, some might swim in shallow water compared to deep water. And then when you have these doubling of the genes, split off, and then this species will become more prevalent in like more shallow water with more sunlight, more tide, and different things like that. So the mutations that'll happen in the split off, like say these 2 different genes, will help this one, it'll mutate this particular one and make it more adaptive to the environment that it's in. And, it's all predicated upon outside forces and, species competing with one another. And, if you get a mutation that's more viable, that makes you faster, makes you swim a little quicker, makes you a little bit more blend into the environment, those are the ones that'll move on. And, that's kind of like how, the evolution of Globin actually worked. It's, it started off as one oxygen carrying molecule and it doubled. And in that, in different species, it eventually diversified. As you can see, you have amphibians, reptiles, duck-billed platypus, marsupials, and eutherians, which is mammals that actually carry their young inside the uterus and actually have a placenta and umbilical cord, whole 9 yards. And in that, it started off with just one, beta. Double the gene, so you have 2 beta genes, and all of a sudden, species A started to survive better because they mutated this beta globin into epsilon globin, or gamma globin, or delta globin. And eventually, over time, they become 2 separate different things. So it takes a while for these different proteins to get to the point where they are different proteins, but in that meantime, it confers a different type of advantage. So what I mean by that is, say beta globin has an affinity or binds to oxygen very well under certain conditions, but not so well in other conditions. So when you double the gene and you get a little mutation in the second beta globin, and the animal lives because it's better at giving oxygen and taking oxygen away, or delivering oxygen to the tissues, then the organism is like, oh wow, that worked. Well, it doesn't know that, but it's carrying this mutation, and eventually they differentiate and they go into different paths. And eventually you have both of these different proteins working simultaneously in different compartments or different fashions eventually, and they become a different type of function based upon their structure. And this is all building because the evidence points towards life coming from simpler life, or these gene splits, and they're called gene families basically, and protein families, and in particular globin's a protein family. It really is a difficult concept for people to understand because it takes millennia, not just millennia, millions of years for these types of things to occur. So we think like, oh well, I adapted to my surroundings by putting a coat on. It's not the same thing as evolving to adapt to the circumstances. It basically will cause them to take different paths. So you'll have just a random mutation in the DNA, whether that's based upon whether that's caused by machinery of the cell that puts a G instead of a T, or an A instead of a U, or an A instead of a T, or whatever. And then when you have that split, you have just like a random duplication event. It's all random, and that's the beauty of it. It's statistically just random. That this mutation will give a benefit over the others in the population, and then it'll split off. So basically, it really works to give you a leg up on the competition, but on the same flip side, it just randomly happens. It's just how it works. Certain mutations are deleterious, which means that you have a mutation and you die. But you have other mutations that give you a benefit or give you that leg up over the competitor, where it could just, in that gene duplication example, like I'm saying, let's say epsilon versus beta or delta versus beta, delta could help you in high altitudes, so that species will live. And it'll confer, like sickle. Thank you, Rosa. Like sickle cell. Sickle cell trait is a very good example of microevolution of humans in the last few hundreds of thousands to millions of years, based upon malaria being such a prevalent disease in Africa, where it mutated the. I forget which gene it is. It's one of the beta globin genes, but it changes the shape. So by doing this, it allows the population that has this trait in this environment to outlive the ones that have normal red blood cells. So instead of being all round, they're kind of like sickles, the thing that they used to use to harvest wheat. And this allows this group of people to pass on their genes at a higher frequency than other organisms in that population. So the other organisms will be outcompeted, and the other ones will live. And that's kind of like a small little instance of a bigger trend, where you really, that's an extended family. Oh, here, like this. where you split off and you start splitting off from different species. Let's say you have an organism that, is living in an area, and a natural disaster occurs or a flood happens, and there's a river that splits the area up. So half the population's over here, half the population's over here. On the one side, it's really dry. So you need animals that can actually live in dry environments, that retain water better, can find food better, or whatever. And then eventually those two species will become different because they live in different areas, they accumulate different mutations, and over time, the group that has a higher rate of mutations that are not deleterious but beneficial will eventually become a different species from the other, based upon whatever traits. So the one side of the river is really green and has a lot of food. You don't really necessarily need to hunt, or you don't need to adapt to the circumstances, so they kind of stay the same. But on the flip side, the other ones need to really hunt differently. They need to go into different areas that they wouldn't have gone before, and certain mutations will give you and confer that ability to seek out food and eventually reproduce and turn yourself into a different species. So I know it's a really hard concept for, it's even like a little difficult for somebody like myself to even explain in the most simplest of terms. But that's where that's what we're trying to do here. But let's look at Animalia, simplified. You start off with a vertebra, your backbone, and you split off, and you split off, and you split off, and you split off. And these are just little traits that pop up. Vertebra, bony skeleton, 4 limbs, like we said, your arms and your legs. Our arms and legs are very similar to the arms and legs of bats and whales and different things like that. They all have your digits. They have 2 bones and 1 bone. And this pattern is seen time and time again throughout all these different types of animals and life. So a good example of adaptation to a specific environment is Charles Darwin's finches. You have different finches with big beaks, little beaks. One narrow, long beak can go inside little holes. The bigger beaks are used to crack seeds, or you can use sticks or twigs with a different type of beak to stick into the little hole and get your little larvae out. And it all comes down to what is the best feature to let you live in the area that you're in so that you can outbeat your competitors. So if I had a long beak and you had a short beak, and my long beak allows me to go and eat little grubs inside little holes, and I eat more and I'm healthier, and I pass this trait on to my kids, and they pass this trait on to their kids, and we outcompete. Your short beak, your kids and your descendants will eventually die out, and mine will evolve into another type of species or a subspecies or whatever, and it'll outcompete it. So basically, it really comes down to a couple things. Mutations that confer an advantage in a population, the subset of that population outcompetes the other, or they kind of split off. And this takes so long. It just takes a mind-boggling amount of time for these small changes to eventually build up, so that you don't necessarily have a modern, like a horse, or a dog. You have a wolf, small changes, small changes, small changes, and then eventually you have dogs. Or, in case of humans, you started off with ape-like or chimpanzee-like ancestors that started to walk upright, or could use tools, or could do different little things that would eventually give them the leg up on their so-called, competitors. And in particular, solo sucks. I really like the discussion aspect rather than just ranting at you guys. But, it really comes down to hominids, or hominidea, yep. Different little things where you adapt to circumstances. Like there's dead ends of our family tree that developed stronger jaws because a lot of hominids ate what's tubers, or what the most common one is potatoes. What's a tuber? It's a thing that's grown underground and you just chew on it and nosh on it. Obviously you ate in trees and different things like that. But if you had a more robust jaw, you can eat tougher and not as nutritious tubers, or in comparison to a more what's called gracile, or a more streamlined jaw, where they actually had to adapt and try to cook food or eat different types of food or search out different types of food. And eventually, there's one in particular. I know this. Robustus. Where are you at? No, not Homo. Rodolphinensis. Ah, no, I can't click it. It's not big enough. Oh, well, there was a Australopithecus robustus, I believe. Don't quote me on the first one. A robustus that developed a huge jaw that eventually died out because the ones that were more gracile that adapted to their environment and started not cooking, but rather eating smaller tubers or eating a more diverse diet. So there's a problem with over-specialization is what I'm getting at, in particular with our family tree line. But, and those eventually died out. And that's why you don't see them anymore, because they were outcompeted by, more modern apes and more humans. But, up on the screen that I have, it's from the Smithsonian Institute's website, and it has a really nice interactive map on human evolution that actually gives you climate fluctuations, major milestones in human evolution, and gives you a nice little family tree of what we actually have found in terms of different species. I'm going to go through a couple. The first one that we have on our tree is, you're going to hate me. I'm going to hate this name. Paranthropus tachadensis. That's a mouthful. Sounds like some Klingon. And while this species is one of the earliest human species, had a chimpanzee-sized brain, it walked upright on two legs and had smaller canines than like other early humans. And then we have Ardipithecus ramidus. Evidence from the pelvis and limbs of the female partial skeleton, Ardi, announced in 2009, shows that this species walked upright, but her opposable big toes helped her climb trees. So there's a theory that that walking upright happened in the savannah, but there's also a theory that, and that's kind of outdated in terms of what we think actually occurred in terms of walking upright in evolution, is that we were still tree bound. We still lived in wooded areas, but sometimes there was a nice little gap between the trees where you had to run from one set of trees to the other. And eventually that was something that you needed to do more often. And if you could do it, that you conferred your DNA, your ability to do that on your kids, and they outcompeted the ones that couldn't do that. So eventually we got more upright and more upright and more upright, and we eventually became the genus Homo. But let's go through a couple more of these. Another one is Australopithecus afarensis, and I hopefully have heard of Lucy. The ape-like proportions of the face and brain case was more ape-like, had strong arms with curved fingers adapted to climbing trees, but small canine teeth and a body that stood and walked upright and arched feet. These adaptations helped it survive during times of dramatic climate fluctuation. So it was a jack of all trades, and if you had these types of features, you conferred those onto your kids, and eventually they outlived the other species. And then there's Australopithecus africanus, was the first early human species to be found on the continent of Africa, and discovered in 1924. Members of the species were mostly vegetarian, with a diet similar to modern chimpanzees, consisting of fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and eggs, based on microscopic wear of their molar teeth. They ate tough foods. And then eventually, these Australopithecus got enough mutations, started walking, got a little taller, lost more hair, got more gracile in the jawline, the masseter muscle got a little higher, and you eventually came up with Homo habilis, which was from 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago. And it means handyman because it was discovered in the Olduvai Gorge in the 1960s. The species was thought to represent the first stone tool maker. And currently, the oldest stone tools are dated slightly older than the evidence of the genus Homo. So there's a little debate on whether it was Australopithecus or if it was Homo that actually started using tools first. So there's also Paranthropus robustus. That's the one that I was thinking about. It's from South Africa. And members of this species had a bony ridge, sagittal crest on the midline of the top of the skull, and a massive face. Both adaptations for chewing tough food. So don't think of it as if one species became the next and the next and the next. Over the whole continent of Africa, there was all these little hominids running around, little chimpanzees, eventually that became chimpanzees, or ones that eventually became like us. But they're all competing with one another, and they're all adapting to certain niches. And eventually the ones that adapted, like the ones in Homo, specifically Homo erectus, outcompeted all the other Paranthropus or Homo species, and eventually became what we are today. And it's not necessarily that Homo erectus became us. A subset of Homo erectus, started adapting a little bit better to whatever environment predisposed them to have a bigger brain, to have to think a little bit more, to design tools, to use fire, different things like that. And that conferred more advantages, more advantages, and more advantages. And specifically, these different populations would then grow into a different species. It's theorized that, Homo, we could have technically mated with Homo erectus because we're so genetically similar, but we're talking about little tiny different changes that will eventually give you Homo sapiens. Let's give another example. Homo erectus, the most successful Homo species, if you're looking at it in terms of timeline, 1.89 million years ago to 143,000 years ago. So they were around when we were around, and we had to compete against this ancestor. This species, commonly known as Homo erectus, but some of the oldest African specimens are thought to represent a related species, Homo ergaster. There is evidence that individuals of Homo erectus were the first early humans to make hearts, to eat a significant amount of animal meat and bone marrow, and to care for the old and weak. So we're starting to see culture and developing, the concepts of loving one another and different things like that on a more modern type of, level. Not just, oh, he's in my pack, I need to make sure he lives, blah, 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 but actually ascribing symbolism to these types of things. It was the longest lived species on our family tree, surviving more than 9 times as long as our own species. So they were very, very, very successful, and eventually a small subset of these Homo erectus, split off, gathered mutations or accumulated mutations that conferred an advantage compared to the other ones, and became a different species. Maybe that's Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo habilis, Homo habilis came before, sorry, or Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals. And it's all like these little splits. And, Homo erectus was actually the first hominid species to leave out of Africa for a prolonged period of time and conquer pretty much the entire old world. And that's why you have Homo florensis out in, or heidelbergensis in Europe, Homo florensis in Southeast Asia, I believe. And, Homo sapiens eventually evolved from Homo erectus that stayed inside of Africa. And, and then Homo sapiens went out and conquered the world, so to speak, and out-competed, the Homo florensis, Homo erectus inside of Africa, and Homo neanderthalis, where we kind of probably made it in. There's genetic evidence that, Europeans have at least 1% of Homo neanderthalis DNA. And it really is kind of fascinating that we're all interrelated, and we've only been around for 200,000 years. Fossils and genetic evidence show that our species evolved in Africa about 200,000 years ago and began to spread out from there by at least 100,000 years ago. And now we live in all parts of the world. Homo neanderthalis, they evolved from about 400,000 years ago and died out about 40,000 years ago when Homo sapiens got into Europe and started conquering Europe. And basically, they sprung off. So what you should think about it is that all these different species come from the same kind of like pool of different species. How do I want to say that? Where Homo erectus in particular, was everywhere. So one evolved in Europe, one evolved in Africa, one evolved here, one evolved there, because they were separate and they couldn't mate with one another. That's another thing. You have to have a closed-off population. So I forgot to mention that earlier. But, it basically comes down to a couple things. You have a population, they accumulate mutations, that confers advantage, they outcompete the other species around there, and eventually, overtake them. Or in our case, there's only one hominid species left because we outcompeted all the other ones, whether that's by dumb luck, by chance, or, whether or not we were smarter and able to grasp concepts a little bit better, or whatever the case is. that, we eventually have all of our, traits that you see today, and we're actually a subspecies of Homo sapiens. We're actually Homo sapiens sapiens because we're modern man, because we had Cro-Magnon man, which was a little bit more dense, bigger brow ridge, different things like that. And, we're becoming more gracile as we accumulate more mutations that confer a better advantage to us. So, bigger brains or more complex brains, or be able to think more abstractly in different types of symbolism. But I think we're almost out of time. So, I just want to wrap up on the thing that all the evidence dictates that it's not just, a belief in evolution. It's something that, time after time after time, an experiment and an observation just adds to the cumulative knowledge that evolution is where, what dictates life on Earth in terms of biology. It's the overarching theme. We see it nowadays in antibiotic resistance bacteria. You give a bunch of antibiotics to bacteria and eventually they become resistant to it by, manipulating this or having a mutation in one of them that, can beat the antibiotic doesn't actually work, and then it outgrows all the other ones that died. And, we see time and time again that this is what is going on, and it saddens me that it's a manipulation of words that keeps people ignorant rather than, I really wish there could be a symposium of biologists that just come together and go, let's call it the law of evolution, because that would put such more of a stamp on it and really define it to people that, hey, this is the thing, like, this is the deal. This is 100% what happened, and, you really can't, debate it. There is no debate. The debate's over. It's frustrating as a biologist to always have to debate people on this. But I really want to thank you guys for joining me tonight. I know that I didn't get into as much detail as I wanted to. I'm back in school, so my first couple classes and first week of stuff has been a little rough in terms of, getting back into the swing of things and get my brain right. Next week, we'll be doing CRISPR-Cas9, the gene editing machine. Basically, it's an adapted form of a bacteria enzyme that actually allows us to knock out specific genes in a very, very specific way, but in a very targeted way to get the desired results that we want. And then we'll be throwing out a new schedule after that. And, hopefully you'll be here next week. Thank you guys for joining me for the solo session of Dr. D's Discussions and letting me rant at you for 45 minutes. We'll see you next week, and thank you for joining. All right, bye-bye.